Hello and welcome to the Iron Maiden. My name is Abby and today I have a video about Face Purgatory, which is Vynnset's main headpiece. I'm going to talk about how it works, how you can use it effectively, and how you can use it in each particular matchup. I'm going to break them down by class so we're not here all day, but still it'll be broken up a little bit so you can understand how the use of Face Purgatory changes depending on what your opponent is playing. So first, let's check about how does Face Purgatory work. Well, it's a Rune Blade head equipment. It blocks for 2, and it has a powerful triggered ability that triggers when you block with it, an attack action card, and a non-attack action card, all on the same chain link. This means you'll be blocking with it for 2, an attack action and a non-attack all on one particular attack, and then the effect will trigger. And then once the chain link resolves and is closed, Face Purgatory will be destroyed from its Blade Break ability. What is the ability actually? Well, it makes your opponent discard a card and lets you draw a card. Well, it forces you to draw a card, in fact. And it triggers during blocks. This is extremely important because it happens before your opponent is allowed to make any attack reactions during their attack. So if your opponent has several attack reactions in hand, they can't respond to the trigger by playing them all. They will have to discard and then go to reactions and play whatever they have left. Your opponent can play instants or activate instants, however, so be aware that some heroes can circumvent the Face Purgatory trigger even when they have cards in hand. The trigger also makes you draw a card, but because you have completed the blocking step by the time you draw the card, you will not be able to block with it unless it is a defense reaction. So you won't be able to draw it and then add an action card to the defending chain unless your opponent attacks again. To trigger Face Purgatory, as I said, you will need an attack action card and a non-attack action card. Note that there are cards in Vynnset that say something like, this can be played as though or an instant if some effect has been triggered. These cards still count as non-attacks, even if they are currently available to be played as though they were instants, because the card type is still non-attack. Because you'll be blocking with it, an attack and a non-attack, you'll normally be blocking either 7 or 8 on that chain link, which is a very large amount of blocks on a single chain link. So usually you'll get 3 from an attack action, and your non-attacks will block either 2 or 3. Vynnset has a pretty close to even split between 3 block and 2 block non-attack actions. And normally the 3 blocks are the ones you'll be happy to block with, and the 2 blocks are the slightly more powerful ones usually. So you can get up to 8 block and the discard and the draw. If we count the discard as 3 value and we count the draw as 3 value, we can get 2 block and then 6 value of cards drawn and discarded. So Face Purgatory can be an 8 value card if you count it like that. Although I'm going to talk about soon how that value is a little bit wonky and can go up and down. Also, don't forget that, as I said before, this is a forced trigger. When it defends with an attack action and a non-attack action, it triggers, they discard, you draw. You cannot refuse this trigger. Alright, let's talk about how to use Face Purgatory in a general sense so you can understand the best practices of playing with it. When you block and activate Face Purgatory on a smallish attack, like this wounding blow for 4, you are blocking 7 on a 4 attack, so you're wasting 3 defensive value, right? If you only wanted to stop the hit and you didn't have the trigger from the face, you would be best off just blocking with the face and a 2 block, or the face and a 3 block, and not wasting the extra card. It's, in that way, much more efficient to block with face on attacks that are at least as large as the number that you will be blocking. So for example, this Raging Onslaught is attacking for 7. If I block 7 with the face, I get my 7 block value. My opponent discards and I draw, so I get much more value from that. Now this value is a little bit wonky, but generally if you have the option between blocking a small attack with Face Purgatory and blocking a large attack with Face Purgatory, you should always choose the large attack, because you know you will have to block 7 at minimum in order to trigger it. It doesn't mean that blocking small attacks is completely worthless, and as we'll talk about in the matchup section, there are many matchups where it is correct, but in general, blocking bigger attacks is more efficient. For a very similar reason, if your opponent doesn't have any cards in hand, then the Face Purgatory trigger is much less efficient. If your opponent can't discard a card, or empties their hand in response to the trigger from a bunch of instants or something, then you will be wasting the 3 discarded value. So for example, on the right side, if your opponent attacks with Wounding Blow, and they have a card in hand, you get 4 block and you discard a card, so let's count that as 3 value. So that's a 7 value out of your opponent that you've blocked and discarded. And if you block Raging Onslaught and your opponent doesn't have a card in hand, you block 7 and they don't discard anything, so that's also 7 value. In this way, the discard can make up for blocking small attacks, but obviously if you block a large attack and get the discard both, then that is still much more efficient. If the opponent doesn't have cards in hand, you still get 2 block and a draw out of face, so it's not worthless to not block that Raging Onslaught with face. It just means that you won't have it later when you want to force your opponent to discard, and you're quote-unquote wasting value. The times that you will be blocking with face, the best times, are these 3 particular scenarios. If your opponent is not presenting you with one of these scenarios, it's probably not worth it to block with face unless there's some sort of weird situation going on. The 3 situations is where you are worried about an attack reaction. So for example, if your opponent has a card or 2 in hand and you're worried that they will attack react to get an on hit through, then it's a good time to use Face Purgatory. If your opponent has a go again attack and you think that they're going to have a pretty big turn, you can cancel this attack and the next attack by blocking and then making them discard a card. So you kind of get 2 chain links worth of value by blocking a go again attack this turn. And if your opponent has 1 card in hand and their arsenal is empty, it can be worth to block with Face Purgatory, because the card in their hand was most likely going into their arsenal, like a defense reaction, and now it is not. So that's still 4 value that's not going into their arsenal, even though it wasn't going to help them this turn, it was going to help them in a future turn. Other than these 3 types, you are often wasting value, or sometimes your opponent looks like they have something, like they look like they have a reaction and they don't, but your aim is to get one of these 3 types. If you draw a card with Face Purgatory and you cannot use it effectively, you have also wasted that value. So for example, if your hand has 2 attacks in it and you block with one of them to trigger Face Purgatory and you draw another attack, you go back to having 2 attacks in hand. And you maybe can't use the second attack, or if you are going to use it, maybe it's very inefficient. So if you end up with that spare attack left in hand, you might have to arsenal it, which is usually not very good, or you might have to keep it in hand because you don't want to clog up your arsenal. This is one of the concerns when blocking with Face Purgatory, is you have a not 50-50 shot because the deck ratios are not exactly split, but you have some sort of coin flip about, am I going to draw an attack or a non-attack, and is the card going to be useful? Maybe you want an attack and you draw a non-attack, and then that's not very useful in this hand. But basically, you can always draw a pretty worthless card off Face Purgatory, and when that happens, you kind of waste value. It's best to mitigate that value if you block with Face Purgatory on a turn where your opponent will attack again. That way you can at least block with the card you drew if the hand still isn't going to function afterwards. So that would look like this. I block the large attack, the Raging Onslaught, that has Go Again for whatever reason. The opponent discards a card, and then they attack with Wounding Blow, and then I have the option to block the Wounding Blow if my hand doesn't function particularly well. In this case, the Face Purgatory still got the 8 value. It discarded a card, drew a card, and blocked 2. And then the card that I drew isn't going to get wasted because I can at least block with it. This is the kind of optimal play pattern in a very general sense. There are ways to get more value out of Face that we'll talk about, but in a math sense, this is the best way to use Face Purgatory. Because it maximizes the trigger without incurring any additional risk about drawing bad cards or anything like that. The kind of worst case scenario is when your opponent attacks with a smallish attack action and you trigger Face and then they don't have any cards in hand or they empty their hand in response, so you don't get any effect from the discard, and then you draw an attack or something that is not helpful for your current hand. So you end up wasting the discard, wasting the draw effect, and overblocking significantly on the small attack. This is the absolute worst it can go. So it's really rare that it is a good idea to block small attacks when your opponent has nothing in hand. The only time when you would do this is when you are really desperate for a particular draw, and you are just gambling your game on drawing a card that you want. But because you're giving up an attack and a non-attack, you should have something you can do with your hand in most cases. An attack and a non-attack is a decent Vynnset hand in most cases. Alright, let's get into the class by class breakdown so we can talk about how things are a little bit different in each type of matchup. Against Assassins, Face Purgatory is very strong because Assassins use attack reactions to make blocking a nightmare. If you don't want to gamble on if they have particular types of attack reactions, you can just block with Face Purgatory, and often this takes away all of the risk out of the turn because they're forced to discard. Maybe they've only got one more card left and they can't go over the 8 block. This is a very effective strategy against both Mario and Slippy. Mario has lots of very large attacks from daggers, for example, and forcing them to discard a card like Tarantula Toxin is kind of a 6 value discard. So we're getting a lot of power out of that. Or if the deck like Slippy attacks you with a disruptive stealth card with Go Again from the hero ability, they can either react or have a second disruptive attack. So you are presented with a fork. If you don't want to deal with this fork, you can block for Face Purgatory. They discard their final card, so they can't react or follow up, which is very, very strong. The best kind of card that you're looking to force your opponent to discard is Codex of Frailty or other really high value assassin cards. If you can get them to discard a strong card like that, then your Face Purgatory goes way up in value. The other assassins, Huntsman and Azuri, Face Purgatory isn't as good against because they are a little bit more predictable, but it's still a very strong headpiece into those heroes because they still do attack reactions and they still attack for enough that Face Purgatory is roughly worth it, like a 4 attack or a 6 attack, stuff like that. Brutes have many large attacks, which is great for Face Purgatory, and they have lots of Go Again or other action point generation, so they are, in theory, very weak to Face Purgatory. If you block Face Purgatory trigger on a turn where your opponent has Blood Rush in effect, you can get extra value. Or if you just block a large attack with Go Again, you can void their second attack or their next attack. This is very strong strategy, but many of the brutes have interesting ways to move around your Face Purgatory trigger. So Rhina will intimidate you, for example, and if they intimidate your attack action out of your hand, now you cannot Face Purgatory because you don't have the requisite attack action and non-attack action, for example. So there is some risk in some of these brutes with Intimidate. Also, RKO is interesting because he has an instant hero ability. So he can make a card base 6 power in response to the trigger, which is sometimes risky. So you only want to be activating face when the KO card is already big, such as if they swing big and they're maybe threatening pummel. That's the best time to face against RKO. In a deck like Tough Nut, they have their Rock, which can only be swung if they have no cards in hand, and Tough Nut can make resources off the top of the deck. So sometimes face purging a Tough Nut actually makes their hand better, because they get to swing Rock instead of whatever was in their hand. That's not always the case, but sometimes. Basically, it's best to only block face when the Tough Nut has 2 cards in hand, or they don't have Go Again, or just block on the Rock instead of the attack. There is some weirdness there. For Guardians, once again, they have many large attacks, although they don't have a lot of Go Agains or action points. So it can just be helpful to block face when your opponent isn't going to be discarding a card, just to kind of refund some of that value and stop a crush effect. Although there are some very strong cards that you can force your opponent to discard. Many Guardians run Pummel. That's obviously a very good card to force discard. And some Guardians run things like E-Strike or Rouse the Ancients, so that they can go again into Hammer or go again into large attack. If you can face on a Rouse the Ancients, you get a lot of value out of a Guardian. Although you do have to worry about both Dominate and Overpower, since they limit you from blocking with both an attack and a non-attack on the same chain link, you won't be able to activate face if your opponent uses either of those abilities. So Betsy, Bravo, and Valda all have pretty easy access to both Dominate and Overpower. So activating face on them is sometimes a gamble, sometimes you just won't be able to. The Talented Guardians are a little bit different. They have some weird stuff going on, especially Lyeth and Pleiades, who have instants. And Jarl is also interesting because he likes when you have exposed zones. So blocking with face kind of turns his hero ability on. The basic ideas from above still function. Some of these Guardians still run Pummel or Go Again cards. Lyeth still has very large attacks, even if they start out small. But you have to just be a little bit smarter and think about if they have an instant in hand, or if it's too early to give your opponent an exposed zone. Most of these heroes on this page are also more fatigue oriented. They tend to try and win the game through stopping Vynnset from playing rather than trying to kill her. So you might want to try and force discard a Ripple Away or other counter card out of your opponent's hand. If you can see that they are holding and not arsenaling a card for a turn or two, that's probably their Ripple Away. Illusionists, which is currently just Ziggy, we lost Prism recently, have many large attacks with Phantasm. If you cannot pop them with a 6 power, or you don't want to pop them, for example, if they have a trigger, you can use Face Purgatory to block out all that damage and refund some of the trigger with the draw. The other thing that Ziggy plays where Face is extremely useful is Gone in a Flash. If your opponent activates their boots, or just plays a kind of value Gone in a Flash turn, you can activate Face Purgatory. If they play the instant, they have to discard the Gone. If they don't play the instant, they discard the instant. So it's kind of a win-win. And finally, Ziggy has fragment attacks, which give -2 and a trigger when any card blocks that has at least 2 power. So you can just block with face as a kind of 4 block, because it blocks 2 and minuses 2 the fragment. This is often worth it into fragment-based Ziggy decks, although most Ziggy decks don't run fragment cards right now, or very few. Mechanologist is another class that has some large attacks with Go Again. They have also some very large setup turns that end with just massive finishing attacks, or finishing non-attacks in some cases. We want to be ending that turn with face a little bit early. So for example, if your opponent is boosting 2 times, and then they play a third boost, and they still have a card and 2 resources, it might be worth activating face. If your opponent has attacked, and then they have a bunch of resources and 3 hyperdrivers, they might mechanoid, so you might want to make them discard it. Or if they have many cogs and they attack with Aeronaut, or attack and you sense an Aeronaut, you can use face on that chain as well. It is best to try and target some of the larger boost cards like Throttle that has 6 power. This is not always doable. Sometimes the max V turn comes with several small attacks. It's still worth it to end the max V turn, for example. But if you can, you want to be targeting the bigger attacks with your face perk. And then there's Teklo, which is kind of a weird hero in this case. Some Teklos will play boost attacks. That makes Face Purgatory a lot better into them. If they are playing a more fatigue-oriented list, they're not playing boost attacks, then Face can't really do anything. Most of their attack actions will have overpower. So you're just either using it to block 2 damage at some point, or maybe you're using it on like a CNC. Whenever it's efficient or easy to use, your hand supports it, just use it then. Necromancers, which for now is just gravy, have some really large attacks and some weirdness going on with Face Purg that we'll talk about. So, for example, the best thing you can do against Gravy is block Conqueror of the High Seas with 2-3 blocks. For example, a Funeral Moon and an attack action, and then face. They discard whatever their follow-up may have been, which is maybe just a blue to play an ally from the graveyard. And you don't get the Arsenal kill trigger. You can also block something like Swabby, which is a very large ally attack, especially if they put one of the on-hit triggers onto the ally attacks, such as the one that makes you discard from hand. You just have to be aware that sometimes these large attacks, their follow-up comes from the graveyard, and you forcing your opponent to discard can actually be kind of good for them. Not great, they probably had a plan anyway, but sometimes it's not as devastating as it should be. And the other one to mention is they have Prismatic Leyline, which is like a turn-wide buff, sort of. If they play that, it's probably a good time to face if you can, although it's not a massive priority. Ninjas are a bit of a weird one. They have very few large attacks, so you really want to be getting your value out of the discard part of the face trigger, because ninjas typically are stronger with larger hands. So if the Syndra or Phi plays some sort of wide buffing card like Spreading Flames, that's going to be a good turn to face, because it will block this chain link and it will prevent a future chain link, which will then take value out of the Spreading Flames. Against Ira, she's a bit more focused on a mid-range disruptive plan usually, so you'll either want to block a middle chain link, like a Bittering Thorns, to try and predict the disruptive 6 power that would finish and get rid of it. If you do that, you get 2 chain links worth of value. Otherwise, you can just wait until they play a disruptive card. For example, some Ira turns are sword for 1, attack for 7. So face blocks that 7 very efficiently. They won't always have a card in hand, but sometimes you can make them discard a defense reaction. So it's not the same use there. It's a bit more like what you do with a Guardian, but it's still a very efficient card. And then against Katsu, you really want to stop their first big combo turn. This is usually the best time to do this would be when they start with Surging Strike. Surging Strike is a 5 attack, so it's pretty close to Face Purg numbers. And if they have the Surging, their hand is probably pretty good, because the deck is based on comboing after Surging. So you really want to be stopping that early. Against Katsu, if you let them hit and then face later, it's often not worth it. Once they hit, their turn normally will function from then on, so you're best off facing early in the Katsu turn. Rangers next are a little difficult to use face on right now. There's only the 2 Rangers, and Marlin has effectively overpower every single turn, which will turn off your Face Purgatory because you won't be able to block with an attack and a non-attack. If they ever send a Harpoon without overpower, you need to use Face if you can. Otherwise, you can just use Face as a 2-block. Putting all of your armor, a D-react, and 1 action card to stop a Harpoon is still very good, even if you miss out on the Face trigger. And then Riptide is also a very weird deck. If they're playing a kind of aggressive list with things like Bolt and Shot, then Face Purgatory is going to be pretty good against them, because you can block an arrow that would come in for 7, and then make them discard their follow-up arrow. If they're playing a kind of defensive style, Face is going to be significantly worse. And you also need to look out for what bow they're playing. Barbed Castaway and a few other bows have instant abilities, so you're going to want to be aware if your opponent can activate and kind of move around the face trigger. Rune Blades. We have 2 Rune Blades in the game right now. We have Aurora and Vynnset. Rune Blades typically synergize cards together, so the less cards they have, the less powerful they are, which makes Face a pretty appealing trigger. But they also have a lot of ways to sidestep the trigger, and they have a lot of ways to kind of power through it sometimes as well. So against Aurora, you're going to want to use your Face against a power turn, like if they play Arc Lightning, less cards equals less damage, kind of like Spreading Flames, or Tempestuous Kiss. You want to be cancelling that turn and blocking out so they can't react or anything silly on top of it. And then the Aurora might be able to follow up with their Sword, which is a little frustrating, but it won't carry any kind of on-hit in that case. And then against Vynnset, it's kind of odd. Vynnset has lots of large attacks, so your Face block value is not going to waste, but they can activate Spellbound Creepers by the time you have the trigger, so they can pretty much always sidestep Face as long as they're paying attention. So it's best to wait until your opponent uses Creepers and then they die, or you can use it while they still have Creepers, but you are kind of gambling if your opponent has a hand that can function or not. If they have 3 cards in hand, that's going to be another good time to Face, because they can't Creepers 2 cards out, they can only Creepers 1 card out. Alright, getting to the end soon, we have Warriors. Warriors use a lot of on-hits and attack reactions similar to Assassins, but the triggers are almost always good for the warrior instead of bad for the opponent. Similar to Assassin though, if you don't want to gamble on the effect, you can just use Face. Each warrior has their own kind of set of on-hits. So Dorinthia has her Swing Agains and stuff like Draw a Card. Kasai has Blood Follows Blade that comes at reaction speed and makes a guy. Olympia and Hulla have their own stuff as well. But basically, you need to be aware of what on-hits your opponent have and which ones can come in at reaction speed, so you don't get got by a Blood Follows Blade, for example. The other thing to be aware of is if your opponent has 1 card in hand and they either don't have any resources or they don't have go again yet, you can Face Purgatory to end their turn early. So, for example, against Hala, if they have Flurry and go again, but they're out of resources, you can Face Purg and then they won't be able to swing their sword again. Or against a Dorinthia, if they attack for a bunch, you can Face Purg and get rid of their go again. So even if they hit, they can't give it go again in some cases. These are really good ways to lower the value from big warrior turns, as well as usually cancelling the on hits. The talented warriors are a little bit different. Bolton has his power spike turns. He has very many weak cards and a few very, very strong cards. So if you're using your face to force them to discard a weak card, not very good. But if you get them to discard a Luminar Ascension or Beacon of Victory, that's extremely good. So you just need to be kind of conscious about how many of these cards your opponent has seen, how they're attacking, what they could have, and just kind of use your prediction and your risk skills to choose the best time to up your odds of getting a Lumina or something like that. Against Fang, it's a little bit different. You're going to want to wait for an important time to use Face. So there are 3 important-ish times of different qualities that you'll want to use Face against Fang. Number 1 is when they use a big front pump like Savor Bloodshed. You can cancel the Savor turn by using Face on the first chain link and then blocking out the second one with 1 or 2 cards. That's a really good way to get rid of, for example, Savor Bloodshed. Then the other 2 are fealty related. If your opponent has 2 fealty and you're marked, sometimes it's worth using Face to make them spend 1 more turn at 2 fealty, and then let them have it next turn. The other one is if your opponent only has 1 card in hand, they sometimes will attack with the dagger, and then react, and then attack with the second dagger. If you force them to discard the reaction, they then won't have played a Draconic card this turn, and all their fealty will die. This is a very game-winning strategy, but most Fang won't fall for it. They won't ever have just 1 card in hand. If you do see a Fang with just 1 card in hand, it's definitely worth trying, though. And then Wizards, which are a little bit of a weird one. The Asilios, which are the only legal wizards right now, sometimes don't play any attack actions and sometimes play lots of attack actions, or sometimes they just play 1 or 2. The best giveaway is what legs they're running. If they're running Lightning Greaves, they are almost certainly a attack oriented deck. They at least have gotten a flash if they're playing Greaves, and usually they have more attacks as well. If they are running something like the legs that let you play on your opponent's turn, then you will be facing a deck that is mostly focused on Arcane. They might have 0 attacks in the whole deck, which is pretty common. So if they attack you physically ever, you're probably going to want to use your chance when you get it. Sometimes it's even worth it just to block 2 with Face and not trigger the ability, because it's just 2 more life that you have. Even if you don't trigger it, it's 2 life that you're not going to get another chance to save, basically. So pay attention to what equipment your opponent is running, what attacks they're running. If it's gone, then target the gone in a flash Greaves turn, and if it's not, block the first time you can. That's all of the classes. I wanted to briefly touch on the weaknesses of Face Purgatory. As you may have noticed, there are some heroes or situations I've talked about where Face isn't particularly good. This is the case even more. I kind of focused on what if you only had Face in this video. So if you are worried about some of those matchups or interactions I talked about where Face is not nearly as good, well, you can put in alternate slots. Crown of Providence and Ebonfold are very strong alternate slots. But I think that if you were only going to run one headpiece, it should be Face Purgatory. It's the best headpiece in more than 50% of matchups, probably, and it's definitely game-changing enough that even if it wasn't the best in 50%, the difference it makes in key matchups is worth playing it for. If you have some sideboard slots, Crown of Providence is really good when you don't want to commit cards to blocking, or you are not allowed, such as against a Dominate deck. And Ebonfold is really good against arcane damage, and it's also really good at accelerating your turns, so it can be used against fatigue or things like Acilio. That's the end of this video today. You can go down below and like, comment, and subscribe. One of the things you could comment is what other big explanation videos you might want to see. I could make a video like this about something like Crown of Providence, Vexing Quill Hand, Creepers, a video about how to use particular equipment, so let me know what you want to see a video about. You can also join the Discord link in the description below, where there are more than 400 Vynnset players in the Iron Maiden Discord. You can also drop your interesting video ideas in there if you're interested in chatting to a bunch of Vynnset players about your ideas. And of course, you can check out my Metafy guides and coaching. If you're interested in Vynnset tournament play, you can go there and buy a guide and kind of boost yourself up to a tournament ready level. That's all for today, so be good.